In our last lesson, we looked at the first three judges listed in the book of Judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. We will begin this lesson where we left off, at the beginning of chapter 4, and discuss the next judge, Deborah. Right at the start in verse 1, the author reports the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, even after the miraculous successes of the first three judges. As a result, in verse 4, we learn the Lord allowed the king at Hatzor, a man that the Bible titles as Jabin, to oppress them. Jabin's military commander was Sisera, who lived in a town called Haroshet HaGoyim. Jabin led a force of 900 iron chariots. You have heard of this king of Hazor before, in Joshua chapter 11. In Joshua chapter 11, Joshua confronted and defeated a king by the name of Jabin, and Joshua burned Hatzor with fire. Bible scholars have concluded that Jabin was a dynastic name applied to the kings of Hatzor. It was like the name Pharaoh in Egypt, or we might call someone his or her majesty. It was not a proper noun, first or last name. Thus we can conclude that Hatzor had revived in the years since Joshua, and now had a new king, reigning at the time of Deborah, the next judge. At this point I want to pause and ask you to open the PowerPoint slides for this third lesson. Go to the first slide after the introduction, and you'll see a map of the tribal allocations. That's slide number 2. On the map, I have red circles and names beside them of some of the geographical places mentioned in this chapter. At the north end of the map is Hatzor. In verse 6 we read that Deborah called a man to lead her armies named Barak, and he was from Kadesh Naphtali. Most Bible scholars believe that Barak's Kadesh Naphtali should not be confused with another Kadesh, a city of refuge that was located north of Hatzor. Sisera, Jabin's chariot leader, was from Haroshet HaGoyim, as I mentioned. There are at least 2 possible locations for this city, but their general location is near the red circle that contains that label. I will go into more detail about this town in a few minutes. Finally, in verse 4 and 5, we read that Deborah judged in the hill country of Ephraim between Ramah and Bethel. I have placed a circle in that general vicinity too. Now the next slide, number 3, is a detailed map showing more of the geography. The purple road is the international highway that goes from Hatzor through the large valley of Esdraelon, or sometimes called the Jezreel Valley in the Old Testament, connecting a pass that went through the Carmel Mountain and then along the coast to Egypt. As you can tell from the map, Haroshet HaGoyim and Hatzor control the north and south end of the international highway that passed through this part of Canaan. With Sisera's large chariot army, he could roam the valley, tax traders, and harass the wealthy caravans that had to travel through the valley on their way from the Mediterranean coast in Egypt to Damascus and places further east or return. Archaeology has helped us to understand the military culture at the time of Deborah. For many years, some commentary writers stated that since this was the Bronze Age, it was not possible for there to be iron chariots. However, the great archaeologist Yagil Yadin, a former general in Israel's army in the late 20th century, has provided evidence that there were chariots in Canaan unique to this period of time. Please turn to the next slide, number 4, and you will see a relief of a Hittite chariot from this period. The Hittites were a powerful nation that provided, for a price, soldiers and equipment to other nations. Yadin noted that on the sides of this chariot were small circles that he concluded were pieces of iron. Since iron was available in the land, the iron circles served as armament or protection to the riders in the chariot. The circles of iron were probably sewn or glued on. Note the very heavy hubs of the wheels and the thick spokes that indicate the chariot weighed much more than the lighter and smaller chariots that we found in the time of Joshua. One of the most interesting recent archaeological findings was a linchpin from an archaeological excavation at El Awat. El Awat could well be Heroshet HaGoyim. Turn to the next slide, number 5, where I have a picture of the metal head of the linchpin. It is an engraving of a woman. Also, I show how the linchpin was inserted into Egyptian chariot axles in order to hold on the wheels. Another interesting feature of El Awat, where this linchpin was found, is that archaeologists have concluded that the city was not Canaanite, but as the archaeologists call it, a foreign city. It might well be that El Awat was in fact Heroshet HaGoyim of the Old Testament, and was populated by Hittite charioteers who were hired by Jabin to help control commerce through the valley. With all this background, we can now continue to review the account given to us in the Bible in the 4th chapter of Judges. Verse 6 reports that Deborah summoned Barak and told him the Lord had instructed her to tell Barak to raise an army from the tribes of Naphtali, Zebulun, and then to go to Mount Tabor. Return now to the next PowerPoint slide, number 6, which is a copy of the map you have seen before. I'd like for you to note the location of Mount Tabor. It is a high hill that rises abruptly from the valley and controls the international highway. Obviously, by placing an Israelite army on that mountain, halfway between Hatzor and Heroshet HaGoyim, it menaced Jabin's control of the international road. You will also note on the map that there is a small river, the Kishon, which flows through the valley, exiting into the Mediterranean Sea. On the next PowerPoint slide, number 7, is a photograph of the Kishon River, and in the background is Mount Carmel. This picture, taken in the summertime, shows that for most of the year the Kishon is a peaceful little stream. In verses 7 through 9, Barak agreed to raise the army and go to Mount Tabor. However, he conditioned his agreement that Deborah was to be with him. Deborah's response, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." And that leads the reader to conclude that the woman who will defeat Sisera will be Deborah. Verse 11 introduces a new person, Heber the Kenite, who had departed from the rest of his tribe. Perhaps he was a shepherd, and Heber and his family had followed his herds north for better pasture, and may have had permission from either Jabin or Sisera for him to graze his flocks on land near Kadesh. However, there is another possible explanation that I find intriguing. Heber's name means ally, and since Kenite identifies him as belonging to a clan of metal workers, the author may hint that Heber had left his people and moved north to serve Sisera as a metalsmith for the iron chariots. Well, regardless of which explanation you like, Heber had left the rest of the Kenites who, as chapter 1, verse 16 reports, had settled in southern Canaan from the Negev. Further, the author suggests that Heber informed Sisera of Barak's military preparations. When Sisera was informed in verses 12 and 13 that a large Israelite army had gathered at Mount Tabor, he mustered his entire chariot army and went to the vicinity of Mount Tabor and camped by the river Kishon. The next slide in the PowerPoint presentation, number 8, is a view of Mount Tabor and how it rises from the valley floor. The next PowerPoint slide is a picture taken from near the top of Mount Tabor, showing the valley floor below where the Canaanite chariot army would have camped. Safe from attack from the chariots on the steep sides of Mount Tabor, the Israelites waited for instructions from Deborah. Suddenly, in verse 14, Deborah announced to Barak the time had come for him to attack down the side of the mountain and defeat Sisera. Well, the Israelite attack caused the Canaanite chariot army to panic, and Sisera, the Canaanite general, escaped by jumping from his chariot and running the opposite direction, interestingly toward the camp of Heber the Kenite. Meanwhile, the Israelite foot soldiers completed the rout of the Canaanite chariot army. Although chapter 4 does not fully explain how this miraculous victory occurred, we can learn more by reading chapter 5. Chapter 5 is often called the Song of Deborah and Barak. Chapter 5 is a poetical victory song that was probably written by Deborah and is one of the oldest poems in the Bible. To commemorate a national victory with songs in the Old Testament times was a common practice. And we can read them, for example, in Exodus 15, verses 1 through 18, which is the Song of Moses after they crossed the Red Sea, or in Numbers 21, verses 27 and 30, and Deuteronomy 32, verses 1 through 43, another Song of Moses. Integrating passages from the Song of Deborah with the events described in chapter 4 reveals that a violent rainstorm must have arisen. See verse 4 in chapter 5. As it did, the Kishon overflowed its banks, and we learn that in verse 21, chapter 5. History tells us that when the Kishon overflows, the valley floor becomes very muddy and impassable for wheeled vehicles like chariots. In 1918, during World War I, the British Army pursued the fleeing Turkish-German armies. As the British entered into the Jezreel Valley after a rainstorm, the flooding Kishon River stopped their vehicles in the mud. Perhaps this is what happened to Sisera's chariots in the days of Deborah. God delivered the Canaanite chariot army into the hands of the Israelite infantrymen through a miraculously timed rainstorm that flooded the valley floor and made the chariots useless. This caused panic among the charioteers and allowed the Israelites to defeat the Canaanites in hand-to-hand combat. Returning to the story, we next read that Sisera fled to the camp of Heber the Kenite. The scripture indicates Heber was not there, but his wife Jael was. Jael invited Sisera into her tent, something that is seldom done in Near East cultures then or now. Sisera probably felt that the woman's tent would be a perfect hiding place. Jael gave him a place to rest and a drink, as the NRSV Bible states, from a skin of milk. If you turn to the PowerPoint presentation, the next slide, number 10, shows a modern Bedouin woman churning a skin of goat milk, not unlike what we read in Judges chapter 5, verse 25. But instead of temporary rest, Jael gave Sisera eternal rest by driving a tent peg through his skull as he slept. When Barak arrived, Jael showed him Sisera's body. And verse 24 concludes, the Israelites were able to continue pressure on King Jabin of Hatzor until Jabin was destroyed. It is then that the reader realizes that God had intended a woman to deliver Sisera into the hands of the Israelites, but not Israelite Deborah, but rather Jael, a Gentile. In Judges 5:24, Jael is called the most blessed of women. Well, what can we conclude about Deborah from these two chapters? Now go to the next slide of the PowerPoint presentation, number 11. Here are a few of my conclusions. You will probably have more. First, she was a leader and is the only woman in the Bible appointed by God to be a national leader of Israel. In Judges 5:6, it is implied that Israel was in a state of anarchy until God raised Deborah. She was an exceptional woman with outstanding leadership traits. Second, she was a prophetess. As such, she received revelations from God and delivered his message to the people. As a prophetess, she joined other women of the Bible who were prophetesses: Miriam, Moses' sister; Huldah, a prophetess in the days of King Josiah; and Anna, who gave thanks in the temple for the infant Jesus; and also the 4 daughters of Philip that we find in Acts 21, verses 8 and 9. Third, we find she was a homemaker. Judges 5, verse 7, informs us she was a mother too. I find it interesting that the Bible doesn't say Lapidoth was the husband of Deborah, but that Deborah was the wife of Lapidoth. And fourth, she was a judge. Only one other person in the Bible was both judge and prophet. That's Samuel. As a judge, she was both the political and the judicial head of the nation. One author has very poignantly pointed out that in the long annals of Jewish history, Deborah alone stands out as a woman who led her nation out of bondage. The name Deborah means bee and describes a busy, efficient, productive woman. And just as a bee is capable of stinging its enemy, Deborah was God's instrument to deliver the fatal sting to the armies of Sisera. Chapter 5 ends with a touching account of how Sisera's mother waited for her warrior son to return. How different are the two mothers, Sisera's and Deborah. Lastly, chapter 5 fittingly concludes in verse 31 with a prayer that all the enemies of the Lord perish as Sisera perished, and all those who love the Lord be blessed of God. And the land rested for 40 years. Another cycle is complete. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 10, introduces us to the next cycle. Following the 40 years of peace after Deborah defeated Sisera and Jabin, Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. As a result, God allowed the Midianites to come against them. From previous accounts of the Midianites warring against the Israelites, we learn that they often allied themselves with other tribes from the east, such as the Moabites in Numbers 22 and 25, and in this case with the Amalekites, who normally lived in the Negev, and some other unnamed tribes from the east. These tribes were nomadic herdsmen from the deserts east of the Jordan River. In the springtime, when it was barley and wheat harvest season, these people would invade the farming regions in the Jezreel Valley and along the Mediterranean coast as far south as Gaza, taking the harvest as well as farm animals. The Midianites were clever in that they did not try to occupy the land. They simply swept in and overwhelmed the land at harvest season, and then they left. Verse 5 compares them to locusts as they swarmed across the land, stripping it bare. Further, there is a reference to camel warfare, and is the earliest Old Testament reference to the use of mounted camels in warfare. These large beasts possess endurance and strength and enable them to travel as far as 100 miles, 161 kilometers in a day, without food or water, and they could carry heavy loads on their backs. It is not surprising that the Israelites felt helpless and fled to caves to conceal their harvests, families, and animals, particularly when they had these big beasts and the Midianites rummaging the countryside. At last, in verse 7, the Israelites cried to God for relief from the disaster that had come upon them. Interestingly, God did not immediately send a deliverer. Instead, he sent an unnamed prophet, who pointed out that the Lord had saved them from Egypt and given them the land. He also explained that God was displeased with them because they did not fear him and were worshiping the local deities. I get the impression that the Israelites were not calling on God because they knew they had sinned. Instead, they just wanted relief from the Midianites. I am continually humbled at how much like the Israelites we are. When difficulties arise in our lives or in our countries, we cry to God for relief, instead of trying to determine why God may not be pleased with us. My prayer here is that when we go to the throne with our requests, we will be open to what God is teaching us through our discomfort. The lesson of the prophet here in Judges 6 is that repentance comes before restoration. Apparently, the prophet's teaching was successful, for in the following verses, we meet the next judge, Gideon. So starting in verse 11, we're introduced to Gideon. His father was Joash, and they were from the family of Abizarites, a clan of the tribe of Manasseh, Their home was in Ophrah, a city that has not been located with certainty. Some Bible geographers place Ophrah at modern Afula. This is interesting since this would put Ophrah in the middle of the Jezreel Valley in the tribal territory of Issachar, not Manasseh. Other geographers put Ophrah about 5 miles or 8 kilometers south of Megiddo in the territory of Manasseh. Refer to the next PowerPoint slide, number 12, to see where these two places are located. In either case, Gideon's family and the people in Ophrah would have been severely affected by the Midianites as they invaded the Jezreel Valley. We read that Gideon was called and commissioned by none other than the angel of the Lord. The fact that the angel's appearance is a theophany, that is, a visible manifestation of God, as was Moses' commission in Exodus 3, verses 7 to 10, is clear in that the terms angel of the Lord and the Lord are used synonymously in verses 11 and 14. The angel finds Gideon threshing wheat in a winepress rather than exposed on an elevated side of a hill where the wind would blow the chaff away. It was clearly an act of desperation by Gideon, as a Midianite threat caused him to seek a secluded place. The angel first says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Well, this should cause the reader to smile, since Gideon obviously was not very brave, as shown by his acts of hiding while threshing. However, this should remind us that God does not save us and use us for what we are, but for what, by his grace, we may become. Gideon responds by questioning why the Lord had allowed all the suffering to occur, and why hadn't God provided a miraculous deliverance? The angel's response must have rocked Gideon back on his heels. The angel said, "Go in the might of yours and deliver Israel from the hand of Midian. I hereby commission you." Well, Gideon protested that he was the least qualified person for such a task. And the angel answered and affirmed that the Lord's power and presence would be with him. But Gideon was still reluctant to believe that he could be chosen for such a task, and he asked for a sign, some proof that God would enable him to carry out this assignment. The proof was dramatic, for when the angel touched the food Gideon had placed on a rock with the tip of his staff, fire came up from the rock and devoured the offering. And when this occurred, Gideon realized what was happening was for real. Therefore, Gideon built an altar there to commemorate the event. Gideon was then given his first assignment, and that was to tear down his father's altar to Baal and the sacred pole that was beside it, probably an Asherah pole. Baal worship involved prostitution, and in some extreme cases, child sacrifice. Baal was believed to be the deity of rain and fertility, and as such was worshipped to bring good crops. Asherah, who was also revered as a deity of fertility, frequently accompanied Baal according to their tradition. Obviously, these images were an affront to God, and it also reveals to the reader the totally sinful state of the Israelites. Gideon complied, and the next morning the townspeople wanted to kill Gideon for destroying the idols. This really confirms to the reader the terrible state of affairs in Israel, and that the local people were willing to kill one of their own for the cause of Baal. Here I should remind you that in Deuteronomy 13, verses 6 to 10, God told Moses that idolaters must be stoned. How fallen the people had become when they ignored God's warning and wanted to comply with Baal's. Gideon's father is revealing too, and should bring another smile to the reader's face. Joash apparently had a conversion experience, and probably reflecting on the Deuteronomy passage I just mentioned, told the townspeople that whoever defended Baal should be stoned. Then he wisely stated that if Baal was so powerful, let Baal deal with the person who pulled down the altar. And as we read in verse 32, Gideon was thereafter called by the name Jerubbaal. In other words, let Baal contend against him. Or another way of saying, let Baal defend himself against Gideon. Well, this is a good place to stop this lesson, and we will continue to learn more about Gideon in the next one.